much. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, a little bit about your name, role, your company, and then to mix things up a little bit, if we can mix in some why Arizona, why Phoenix, relative to the space industry. So, John, we'll start with you, please.
Great, thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's John Reeves. I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Global Affairs at Viasat. We're a global satellite communications technology company based out of Carlsbad, California, just north of San Diego. We have here in the Phoenix area in Tempe, actually one of our largest and arguably, maybe not even arguably, our most important facility where we do our advanced payload manufacturing. So we have a team of incredibly capable engineers here in the Phoenix area. We chose the Phoenix area in large part because there was already a hotbed of innovation in this ecosystem. We entered the area actually via acquisition and have had a really wonderful experience here over the past 20 plus years.
Great, thank you. Dan, you're next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan Hart, president of HarTechnologies. We're an advisory group advising government agencies, investment companies, and individual companies in space, defense, and technology. And actually, you'll be hearing from one of my colleagues, Matt Samaglia, this afternoon on the quantum panel. My background, I've had a career through human spaceflight, launch vehicles, building satellites, and I spent a decade shuttling pretty much between Chandler and Tucson because I was chief engineer of our nation's primary missile defense system, GMD, and the booster was built down the road here in Chandler, and the seeker, which does the business of taking out ICBMs, was built down in Tucson. So pretty big adventure here in Arizona. I'm on the Space Studies Board for the National Academies, which does the 10-year science plan for NASA, and I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, so when I get an opinion, an op-ed comes out.
Thank you, and certainly least, my name is Sean McDevitt. I'm a partner at Arthur D. Little, which is a global management consulting firm. I focus primarily in digital infrastructure, so a lot of work in fiber, towers, data centers, as well as the satellite industry. And the Phoenix connection's a little more tenuous. We've done a lot of work with some of the people who are building fiber in and around the Phoenix area. So for a lot of the financial players who are backing the new fiber providers that are bringing fiber to residences and businesses. So that's the connection. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you. We'll start out with a broader question. I think, the space economy has been increasingly dynamic over the past, 3 to 5 years, and it has started to move in perhaps some unexpected directions that people have seen. So I'm curious, what do you see from your vantage point in terms of key trends or key technologies that are having the most impact? Dan, we'll start with you.
Well, we've been in an incredible stage of transformation in space, driven primarily by two things. One is the advent of usable small satellites. Small satellites used to be sort of an interesting hobby in the industry, and over the last 5-10 years they've become very capable and much less expensive and much lower costs in launch. And so the economics of starting a satellite venture have gone from 20 years ago, if you had $500 million, you could probably start something, to now if you have $50 million or even less, you can at least start a venture. And that has actually led to satellite ventures and satellite production globally. I don't know if I can name a country that doesn't have a satellite factory of some sort in it today.
And John, same question to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Sean. And Dan, I would just pick up with one of the themes that you were hitting upon, which is that access to capital has become much easier, I think, for companies also, right? It's been something that we've seen massive private investment in the United States. I think that access to capital, the possibility and the opportunity that exists in commercial space has been something that's really grabbed people's attention over the past several years. And I think that we're starting to see some of the dividends of those investments across the space. I think that more broadly, I think that you're starting to see, because of the massive innovation that's happened in several of the areas in space, we're talking Earth observation, communications, and so on, that there are some really important questions being asked, I think, right now that are relevant to a lot of what we'll discuss today around issues such as security and sovereignty and sustainability, these things that I think we'll continue to deal with as a community for the next generations.
Great, thank you both. Dan, we'll start with you with a slightly different question. You've had a long history in the industry, both governmental, private sector. How have you seen, shifts and changes in the role that government has and private sector has in developing the industry?
Yeah, well, I think that really connects with John's last comment about private capital and what that enables. And, there has been for almost forever the idea and goal of space becoming more commercial, government buying space capability or assets on a fixed price basis where full responsibility is on a company or a corporation and risk moves from government to industry. And that is actually taking hold significantly, somewhat from the technologies I mentioned, but more importantly from, as John said, the input of capital, the willingness to be entrepreneurial and take risks, and the government's willingness to step back a little bit and actually contract in really innovative fixed price manner. So, we're seeing capabilities being bought the way they buy land vehicles now, or land-based communication.
John, anything to add?
Only, touching on commercial space, because there are so many dual-use technologies that have been invented and are now in service. I think that, Dan, you talk about the kind of the government contracting side of that, which is so important, and I think that there's the anchor customer element of that that's really critical to encouraging further investment in those technologies and helping to drive and accelerate that growth.
Yeah, great point. The government's expressed views have been, we want to buy capabilities that have, can sustain themselves on the commercial side while government leverages them and their capabilities on the government side. So they don't have to own the design, own the whole company.
We've talked a little bit about innovation, and if we look back over history, Viasat's been an extreme innovator, maybe the OG innovator in the space. I'm curious to hear more about where is Viasat looking to go now to maintain that level of innovation in the industry in light of lots of new entrants and new constellations and new opportunities.
I'm going to start with just a little bit of history because I think it's important in terms of context for Viasat specifically. So Viasat was founded back in 1986 by 3 young engineers at the time, our CEO and still chairman, Mark Dankberg, Steve Hart, and Mark Miller. And they created an environment that they all wanted to work in. They were engineers that wanted to focus on solving the hardest possible problems that had a market opportunity that they could potentially address. And I think they created an engineering culture that was really focused on understanding how to determine what was truly impossible and what was highly improbable, and being able to solve some of those problems and deliver solutions to the market they thought would pay dividends. We've seen that in the results that we've had over the past 30 plus years. We've had, we're now a $4+ billion revenue company with a global footprint involved in everything from, from connecting rural areas to innovating in the direct-to-device space, which is an area that we're extremely excited about in the technologies coming forward to support broader adoption of direct-to-device technologies, to in-flight connectivity experiences that have truly been changing the way that we live and work. I know I, unfortunately, was in the position of having the ability to work all day yesterday on my flight from Washington, D.C. So it's a double-edged sword potentially sometimes. But I think that you've seen those innovations. I mentioned on commercial, there's the maritime space where we've seen exciting innovations happen there for the evolution of safety services, which our Inmarsat brand has been responsible for going back to the late 70s in its origin as an international organization. And then I think with the Viasat piece, and we do a lot on the government and defense side of the equation, both in the United States and with our international partners. I think that what we fundamentally did is over time, we're able to partner with companies like the Boeings of the world and the Northrop at the start to get involved in predictable revenue projects where we could then reinvest, where we could grow our engineering talent and cadre, and then we could start to really understand what the future was going to look like and how could we change our focus. A pivotal moment for us happened in the 2000s when we saw that the legacy satellite architectures were really being designed to serve a broadcast use case. It was a one-to-many type of connection that companies wanted to have with their users. And we started to see this emerging use case driven by a lot of the mobile networking technologies where there was a desire for more interactive broadband experiences. But the satellite architectures themselves were not designed to support those use cases or optimized to support those use cases. So we, coming back to this issue, we really looked at that through the lens of how impossible is this problem to solve, or is it just highly improbable? And the legacy manufacturers of satellites were unwilling to make a bet that they could achieve not only the technology, but deliver the services to market that would be valuable. And so we devoted our own resources, and we hired the engineering talent required to actually do our own payload designs, and we launched our high-throughput satellite Viasat-1 in 2011. I think what that means, Sean, is we're really focused on understanding where the world is headed. I think that's driven by the people, as I mentioned, in terms of the founders. I think it's driven by the company culture and wanting to solve these hard problems. And I think it's driven by customer intimacy and truly understanding what your customers need and how you can get out in front and have that relationship so that you can make the right decisions when it comes to investing in the technology roadmap.
Dan, any thoughts on that answer?
Well, I I know of Viasat well because when I was at Boeing running the government satellite programs, my counterpart was building and wrestling mightily, I will say, to get Viasat 2, which was absolutely disruptive capability in space. And so you guys came in with your elbows, pretty pointy on a very, very established geo satellite community. Now, and you're continuing to have to innovate now because you've got new players, the LEO constellations, hybrid constellations, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's right. The sector's changed pretty dramatically, but one of the things that I didn't touch on is when we got involved in the satellite services delivery side of the equation, we didn't have our own space segment. So we were expert in some of the modem technology, right, and some of the other elements from a networking perspective, but we had to use other people's satellites. And so we actually stood up a network that was comprised of other people's satellites globally. That's how we managed our users predominantly on the government side. That network actually still exists today. So if you take an ecosystem approach, which is what we took, and then we kind of augment through the innovations that we make in terms of our own broadband capabilities and layer those into the overall network architecture, what we think is really exciting about that is that it then takes advantage of all the other assets that our partners have been able to invest in field, and it creates what I would refer to as layered resilience for our users, so that you're not relying on a single network, you're not relying on single points of failure in terms of delivering service. You have a layered approach so that you can have users roaming among a constellation of satellites effectively. And then as the innovations occur, you can then mature your relationships, such as the announcement that we made this week about our relationship with Telesat. Last year, we made the announcement about our relationship with OneWeb in terms of integrating some of these newer LEO services into our overall service offering. So I think it's having that ecosystem mindset, in that you can solve important customer problems and achieve the outcomes desired by taking a really a clever approach to both partnership and in understanding what the jobs to be done really are.
Thank you. We've touched a little bit about technological advances. I'd like to take that down a level. We've seen advances in propulsion. We've seen advances in navigation.
You can say we're geeking out.
We're geeking out now. But propulsion, satellite miniaturization, all of these change some fundamental underlying economic components, which you touched on earlier. But it also then has a broader impact. So, Dan, I'm curious about your thoughts about how these very specific technologies are really changing the landscape.
Well, it wasn't very long ago when satellite image analysts were all in a very dark room somewhere outside of DC or something. And every once in a while, maybe at the UN or maybe at some high-level meeting, a little bit of information would leak in. Well, today, I don't watch the evening news without looking at a satellite picture. My wife will be sitting next to me saying, You know, I mean, just about saying, you know, let's see, is that a troop carrier or is that, you know, those are things that happen in these, you know, very, very secret, very much behind locked doors. So satellite imagery has come into our lives. It's crept in. Businesses are starting to use it, agriculture, different technologies in space, synthetic aperture radar, infrared, hyperspectral, so you could see minerals, for instance, from space and know where to dig. And those of you who follow archaeology, I mean, heck, we're finding cities in the jungle that, you know, are just out there because we can see them from space. So an amazing, you know, amazing amount of movement forward, and our expectations, of course, continue to keep up with that. So, you know, now we're wondering, why can't I see my house from 10 minutes ago? You know, and we will see that kind of stuff with remote sensing and communications working together.
John, same question to you. How do you see these evolving detailed technology underpinnings changing the economics of the business?
Well, I think you're seeing this, and I'll speak, and Dan, you make a great point when it comes to Earth observation and just kind of the integration of the Earth observation capabilities, commercial specifically, into our daily lives. I think we don't appreciate enough the role of these space-based technologies in terms of actually the impact that they're having on us every day as terrestrial users. I think that when it comes to convergence is really what I'm seeing from a communications perspective, is you have, and I'll use the example of this just from our, you know, when you're sitting at home. I have Verizon Fios at my house. I'm not using the cellular network typically when I make a phone call, and to me as a user, that's completely, you know, it doesn't matter to me. I have a job to be done. I need to make a phone call. My device helps me understand which transport path I'm going to use to do that job efficiently and effectively and reliably. I think that what we're seeing across the ecosystem is more convergence of these terrestrial and space-based technologies. And I think that's going to result in people being better connected all the time. I think, you know, when we talk about the direct-to-device landscape and where that's headed, we're really in a position where, you know, when you drive toward standard-based open architectures where others can participate in the ecosystem, where you can then reduce some of the friction that's existed historically in a lot of satellite communications, which comes to the terminal side of the equation. When you start to remove some of that friction, you can really achieve some massive scale and adoption of the service. So I think that those are types of technologies, Sean, where I think you're going to see people always connected. They won't appreciate, is my prediction, that those are space-based technologies, but it will change the way that we interact. It will change the way we transact with digital payments and those types of things in very remote rural areas moving forward.
I mean, there's an expectation now that capabilities in space are a part of our life, and it's been a steady change. I remember years ago, I've been working on wildfire technology for a number of years, and I remember talking to the governor's office in California at one point a few years ago and suggesting that we use remote sensing from space, and initially they looked at me like I was out of my mind. You know, yeah, we're going to have a space program. Well, today, every 15 minutes or so, CAL FIRE gets an exact fire line of exactly where the fire is and some prediction where it's going because of they are using and very much familiar with what's going on in space.
Good, John, we're going to shift back to you. If you think about, you know, the emergence of LEO constellations, also technologies like AI, are there particular things that you at Viasat and Viasat are doing to stay on top of those trends or to kind of involve your business model?
Yeah, I think I'll tackle the AI piece first and then into the LEO piece. I think from an AI perspective, I think I joined almost every other company in the world in wanting to look at AI through the lens of how you can transform your business and run your operation and effectively. So we're involved in that. I think that there are specific things that I think of when it comes to the adoption of AI and the role that AI is going to play in our lives moving forward. And it kind of comes back to the point that I just made about direct-to-device, which is we're going to want to have access to AI tools and technologies regardless of where we are, so that we can have the assistance of those tools and applications throughout the world. So I think that connectivity, satellite-based connectivity in particular, will play a critical role in enabling connectivity all the way to the edge to allow these technologies to be used to their fullest extent. I think, Sean, on the second part with LEO, it's been obviously a fascinating evolution, I think, in terms of the number of satellites that have been deployed in LEO, and that's not just communications, that's also with Earth observation capabilities, et cetera. One of the things I like to point out when we have this conversation around LEO technologies is typically how it's discussed, is that we view LEO as a physical space where you would put your technology, not as a technology in and of itself, because there are really incredible inventions and innovations happening across all orbits in space. That's something I'd like to really reiterate. And there are very specific attributes that are both desirable and undesirable, depending on your user application, your job to be done, depending on which orbit you have technology deployed in. So I think that's something when I talk about convergence, looking at it through the lens of an ecosystem, and the fact that a communications technology deployed in low Earth orbit can have certain attributes that are absolutely beneficial to the job that you need to have done. There are times when that actually also works against you, and that more perfect supply and demand matching, for example, from an efficiency perspective of geo-based capabilities is really desirable. So I think it's about leveraging these technologies smartly together in a multi-orbit and resilient way.
Anything to add to that?
Well, as I said earlier, I think LEO, the technologies that have enabled useful small satellites are really have been a huge change, because it has kind of democratized space. And as I said before, I remember not very long ago there were maybe 6 or 8 really meaningful satellite manufacturing locations on the world, and now there are dozens and dozens. And not only that, but there are conferences where if you go to the SmallSat conference in Utah, and you walk down an aisle, and everybody will have their gizmos and gadgets. And there's a propulsion system there. That's a sensor. There's a navigation system. By the time you walk down an aisle, you can have built a satellite. And this is technology that not long ago was only available in the national labs and a few companies. I remember walking into that conference, and a sophomore from Egypt came up to me with a satellite in his hands, the size of a toaster oven, and said, "Can you give us a ride?" Sophomore in college. If I went to my advisor when I was a sophomore and said, "I want to build a satellite," he would have patted me on the head and said, "That's very nice."
We've started to touch on, I think, some strategic and perhaps geopolitical considerations, and I promise we'll not use any of the T words, tariffs, Trump, or whatever. But with rising international competition, lots of private players being able to launch satellites, as well as a broad swath of governmental and sovereignty issues related to this. How do you see that, unfolding? How do you see this balance for innovation, but also kind of geopolitical and other strategic considerations? Dan, why don't we have you start there?
Well, I think first, we haven't really talked about the sectors, so let's just outline that for a minute. There's the commercial sector, like commercial communications, commercial remote sensing, selling images to people and companies. There's the civil space world of space exploration, and there's a heck of a lot going on there. And there's a bit of a lunar economy forming. Now, there's a lot of discussions about should we go to Mars or somewhere else, but right now, there's a lot of the commercial sector, and a lot of governments are focused on an enormous project for humanity, which will be decades long and have an economy into itself. And then probably, maybe most importantly right now, there's national security, where there's a lot of money going into protecting our assets, potentially, denying asset in space, and so there's quite a bit going on there. And the international environment is different in each of those three sectors. So the commercial community obviously continues to collaborate as much as possible, supply satellites and hardware, the lowest cost, the more capability, people buying things from across the Atlantic or from Canada, making things in Mexico, and scientists and engineers working together. Civil space, there's the Artemis Accords and the Artemis Project that I kind of just referred to, and that's a whole set of activities and discussions of how we work together, what kind of norms of behavior we should have. And there's been a lot of bilateral and multilateral discussions there that hopefully continue. And then in national security, I mean, we have a Space Force now. There's Space Command in most of our European countries. There's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of mischief going on in space right now. It's kind of like all the stories about submarines dodging each other underneath the polar regions in the 1950s and 1960s. It's a very nervous time, honestly, and there's quite a bit of focus that we don't know enough of what's going on in space with situational awareness from Earth and satellites, and whether we have enough tools in hand to take defensive and offensive effects. And all of those three things are rippling through the space economy right now, with allies and across the table with folks who aren't allies.
John, Viasat's obviously been a global player for quite some time, and you need to navigate pretty significantly shifting regulatory regimes in different regions, as well as different governmental priorities and practices. Given the context of what we were just talking about, curious to hear your experiences and what Viasat's doing in that area.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So first, Dan made a bunch of incredibly good comments right there that we could talk about for a week, I think, and have a really healthy conversation around. So point just being, it is a really complex and dynamic time to work through these issues. I think what I would say, and I'll get to kind of the regulatory piece a little bit here, but I think it's important from, this is my perspective, is that space, I don't think people can debate, is a global resource. And I think that we need to cooperate in space. I think that it is definitely a dynamic geopolitical time in terms of where we are, in terms of international cooperation in space. I think there have been a lot of positive programs. You mentioned Artemis Accords. I think the moon, Viasat's actually announced some work with ESA on a project called Moonlight, which is about communications for that ecosystem to evolve. I think ESA's looking at as a €100 million or 100 billion euro economy for the lunar economy. So there are all kinds of opportunities that are going to require intense international collaboration. And I think that it's a real challenge, to be frank, to get all countries into a room. You see this happen with things like radio frequency spectrum at the ITU. There are all kinds of challenges to get folks aligned in terms of what do we need to do from a regulatory perspective? How are we going to share resources equitably? And then what I would say is, if you look at space and you talk about kind of protect and defend, or the contested environment potentially that we will see in space, I think it's to all of our benefit to find a way to cooperate in space so that we can create a sustainable space ecosystem and economy moving forward. I think it's going to be, it already is in so many ways entrenched in our lives in an incredibly impactful and meaningful way, to where if we don't sort out the regulatory pieces in terms of how are we going to share, how are we going to incentivize all countries to participate and benefit from space so that we all have a shared interest in protecting the resource, I think if we can't figure that out, then we're going to have some serious things happen.
So Dan, if you can pick that up, what regulatory dynamics or frameworks are needed so that we don't, I guess, turn into the wild, wild west?
All over it. So number one, we are the wild, wild west in space. I mean, it's happened. When we drive our cars, we know we're supposed to stay in the right hand of the road, and if you're going to turn, you're going to turn on your signal, you're going to go extra fast if the light is yellow. We have very specific norms of behavior that we require when we drive, when we fly, how we communicate. That doesn't exist for the most part in space. There's cooperation that is happening at varying levels. You know, most of the commercial community in the U.S., I mean, or the commercial community has to be licensed by the FAA and the FCC, and so there's certain touch points that our community has. But even within the U.S., you know, how close you get to another satellite physically, when you report, how far ahead you have to know if you're going to get too close, and what happens next. Those things are still being formed. And we don't have, you know, visibility like we do in air, where we have radars all over the place and we've got beacons on everything, and for the most part we're tracking. So there's an enormous amount of work to do. And then when you look at things like the US and China, there's even less. I mean, there are some, if the US has a policy that if we see a conjunction, a collision about to happen, our Space Force notifies the other country. So there are some items there, but we would love to get, you know, China to sign something like the Artemis Accords that says basically, at least fundamentally, what are we trying to achieve in space, and then get down to brass tacks. There's an effort in the Commerce Department for space traffic management, like air traffic management. It's pretty new. As a matter of fact, I was talking to the previous director yesterday, and I mean, they started it by having commercial companies coordinate their trajectories, their changes in orbit, so they can start to see and coordinate and give people warning or notification. So that's begun. And then the other part is debris and how we manage debris and how we create it. So, you know, we've got a gazillion LEO satellites now. Now, the good thing about LEO, or low Earth orbit, is there's a little bit of atmosphere there, so they decay faster. But in a high low Earth orbit orbit, I mean, it can still take decades for it to come down. So, you know, we have problems with unexpected stages, batteries exploding, causing debris. And then I'll just end with the biggest risk we have, by far, is back to contested space. I mean, we've had China and Russia recently, and even India, do anti-satellite kinetic missiles, that caused, I mean, the Chinese debris field for when they destroyed one of their own weather satellites to demonstrate their anti-satellite capability is still orbiting and will for, I think, a couple more decades. And so we're creating huge smudges in space that, you know, may be contaminating critical environments that will limit us for a long, long time.
John, same question to you.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the sustainability piece, I think it's a real issue that needs to be addressed. I think that it's even fascinating to me that over the past couple of years, you've had incidents occur where you've had space debris, you know, fall through the gentleman's home in Naples, right, last year, and you had big part of a booster landed in Africa, right, I think a few months ago. It was always kind of talked about as, oh, this is a possibility, but now you're actually starting to see some of that occur. I think there have been questions raised by some universities about the impact on the atmosphere for, you know, the aluminum oxide issue, and I think that there's a lot that needs to be done there. I think also more broadly, you talk about the difficulty in tracking space objects, right? But there are 30-some thousand trackable space objects, I think. There are millions that we can't track. And having situational awareness there is incredibly important so that you can make the most effective and efficient use of space. This is where I think I would come to the fact that, you know, we talk about you know, the magnitude of space in the overall domain and what you're able to achieve in terms of number of objects that could safely operate in space. And I think that we still have questions that we don't know the answers to around some of the science there. And, you know, how many objects can we safely sustain? Understanding that there are failures, right? Like you mentioned, batteries exploding or what have you. I think that it's a real challenge. And I think that this is where, again, from an international cooperation perspective, we have to recognize that, you know, yes, space may be extremely large, but the usable areas of space around Earth for these capabilities that we're talking about are actually pretty finite. And we need to have an understanding, and we need to have frameworks so that we can work together in an international multilateral context to address these issues and make sure that, as I mentioned, all countries have access to space. All countries can innovate. Like you mentioned, Dan, it's a great story with the Egyptian who came to you, the student, right, with the satellite. But these are the things, because the cost of launch is coming way down, right, because of innovations in that space, and I hope to see continued competition in those dimensions to make space more accessible. I think that makes it even more imperative that we address those situations through international conversation around frameworks for sustainability.
Hey, just to hijack the question for a second, because John, you mentioned, a lot of international collaboration, and, that is one thing that I think most countries today are thinking about is what is going to be our part of the space economy, and what sovereign capabilities do we need for our own national security? And it's really interesting watching countries start to noodle through this, because it's very difficult to be everything. And so, is a country going to be a satellite manufacturer? Are they going to be a sub-tier supplier? Are they going to be an applications provider? I think every country, for the most part, is trying to think through what is our part of the space architecture. How do we interact with the large companies? How do we create jobs and technical skills in our country? And how, as a government, do we then trade off with the U.S., with Russia, with other countries in our area to create a regional capability? You see that in the Middle East. You see that in Europe. You see that in the Far East. It's going to be really interesting to see the moves that they make to stimulate growth in their areas.
It really is an interesting tension, right, between the adoption of some of these commercial technologies, for example, at scale, because you benefit from the sheer scale and opportunity from a performance perspective that exists with commercial technologies, and what countries are deeming to be essential to their own national security and sovereignty. So I think that you're going to see that continue to evolve. I think that there will be, a number of providers, us included, that are looking at taking advantage of the opportunities that exist to deliver the requisite capabilities for countries to really feel that they have control of their own sovereignty when it comes to space. But I think it's a fascinating topic that's going to continue to play out.
Taiwan and their decisions to not use a Starlink capability, for instance, but start to form their own backup communication, is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I think you've seen this happen in a number of other countries too, right? Where they're determining what capabilities they truly need to own themselves so that they can maintain that sovereignty. And then I think you made another really good point, Dan, which is about the economy itself and how are countries determining where they can succeed in competing in this global landscape. So that'll be interesting to see how that evolves also. There are obviously, access to capital is going to be a huge one in driving that. That's where the U.S. companies have a pretty significant advantage, I think.
As we head toward the wrap up, maybe a couple quick questions in a row. Is there anything in particular that you're excited about? It could be a technology, could be some new business model. Dan, I'll start with you. Anything that...
Okay, yeah, I'm going to switch gears completely. So I've had the privilege of being on the National Academy Space Studies Board and gotten to see what our next decade looks like in space, astrophysics, planetary science, heliophysics, and it's amazing. And so, it hasn't been very long ago we discovered that we've been looking at what we've been looking at is only 5% of what is out there in our universe. And now we're starting to map dark matter. Our astrophysicists are creating a map of the dark matter in our universe. And that will be available probably in the next couple of years. We are on our way to Europa to see if there's any life in an undersea ocean. We just flew the closest spacecraft ever to the sun. The sun's really important because it puts out these, not only does it light our day, but it puts out storms every 11 years. In the past, some of them have caused, in 1869, they caused the telegraph lines to spark. Now, if we get a storm like that today, it would devastate our power infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and most things in space. So knowing and being able to predict space weather is really important. And just one more thing. We're about to put out what's called a gravitational observatory in space. It's a new way of looking at space. So I bring that up because I think we don't usually talk about the importance of scientific leadership for the United States, and to maintain that. We focus on bite-sized accomplishments, but we don't usually look at the big picture. And it's our advancements and it's our leadership in science that feeds engineering and feeds innovation and keeps us ahead.
John, same to you. What gets you excited?
Why do you have to steal all my answers? That's what I want to know. And seriously, I think there are a couple of other areas. You talk about science. I think it's really critically important. I think when you talk about capabilities like solar power from space, right? I think that's really interesting in terms of how that could transform life on Earth. I also, just from obviously a biased perspective in communications, I think free space optics are really interesting in terms of what they could do to really remove some existing constraints that we have around radio frequency spectrum and whatnot moving forward. So I think there are a number of areas here that are going to be fascinating to see how they evolve over the next decade.
Take the opposite tack now. What keeps you up at night? And John, we'll start with you. What either risks or nightmare scenarios worry you?
I really think it comes back to our conversation around the international collaboration in several of these areas. I think that there are all kinds of reasons why we should collaborate with one another. I think that there are all kinds of very human reasons why we end up failing at making real progress in these areas. And that's the thing that I think keeps me up at night, is that there's real opportunity for us to implement smart frameworks around regulation, around sustainability, that will put us in a position where we truly have an enduring and an enduring space economy that we're all going to benefit from. I'm afraid that we won't move quickly enough, or we won't be able to work collaboratively enough to make that happen.
All right, Dan, what gives you nightmares and what keeps you up at night?
I'm on the same page. Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all said, basically, when before the peaceful use of space agreement was put together in the early 60s and late 50s, that if we cooperate in space, we will avoid our tendency for conflict. That we need to find ways to cooperate. And I look at, for instance, our Artemis project to the moon, and the fact that the Chinese are leading a research station project to the moon, which is pretty much the same thing. And so we're both going back to the moon in like parallel play, kind of like toddlers do, without any collaboration. And I would love to see a day when, even with intense commercial competition, which I'm convinced will never go away, but that we find ways to collaborate. A lot of people don't know that we still have astronauts coming down on Soyuz capsules from the Russians. We have ways to coordinate and communicate and collaborate scientifically and engineering that kind of binds us in ways that sometimes on the Earth we're not able to. And I'd like to see a future where we are making the most out of space and, really keeping the vision alive for all humankind.
One last question before we wrap, and I'll start with you, John. Let's make it near term, no pie in the sky, no pun intended. Next 3 to 5 years, what is something you think the average person is going to experience in their day-to-day life that is going to be enabled by what we're seeing happen in the space economy?
I think that we're going to see I'll have to caveat this a little bit, because it will not all be a broadband experience for all 2.6 billion unconnected users currently in the world in the next 3 to 5 years. But I think that you will have the majority of those 2.6 billion being connected better in a more ubiquitous fashion because of the innovations that are taking place across the satellite communications ecosystem.
Same to you.
I think space will creep into our lives further as we sort of started, to where if you're a business or an individual person and you want to know what's happening in on your company's grounds, or how your house is, you'll be able to just dial up a satellite picture in infrared and synthetic aperture radar, and 1 minute later you'll have it.
I want to thank both Dan and John for their time, and thank you, audience, for your listening pleasure, and we appreciate the time. We'll be available for questions subsequent to the panel, and we'll declare victory and hand it back to you.